Hi, everybody. In this podcast, we are going to begin to take a look at the idea of population ecology. So here we're going to spend some time looking at the effect the environment and other factors have on the rise and fall of different populations in different ecosystems and communities. So let's get right to it. So first, before we get started, we really need to answer the question, what is a population? Okay, so you might have some ideas in your mind right now. There's going to be a definition we're going to work with that's going to take us through the year as we work on different aspects of biology. We'll come back to this idea of the population several times. So when we think about a population, I'm sure you've got in your head probably the first thing is human populations, right? We can think about us as a human and our population. We have, you have this single creature here. We have a butterfly. So single organism isn't going to be a population, but when we start to add many of them into an area, so here we have a lot of, some of the monarchs, and right now monarchs are making their way south to Mexico. The monarchs that you guys saw just towards the end of the summer here are taking an enormous trip. They are going to fly the entire way from here all the way down to this one small area of Mexico where they are going to gather here on a mountaintop in these big groves of trees. And if you can look closely, all of those little oranges there's just millions of monarchs that fly down. What we have here is a population of monarchs. And so for us, a population is, a group of the same species that interbreed, so that means that they can actually mate and form fertile offspring, and they are existing together in the same area, but the overall key to this population idea is they're existing in a particular area at a particular time. So it's not just that you're the same and that you're in the same place, it's that you're existing at the same time. So the monarchs that are hanging out as they travel down and when they get together down in Mexico during our winter, they are this enormous population that is there. So if you look, maybe there'll be a few stragglers left, but most of them are heading south. So other examples of populations, what I would like you to do in your notes, and we'll talk about this in our disco, is I would like you to think of 3 other populations and write those down in your notes right here under number 1. That's what I would like you to do. See if you can come up with 3 populations that describe what they are, where they are, and at what time. Okay, so see if you can write basically 3 sentences. So if you need to, take a second and pause and write those down. Or you can go back if you want to as we go through this. If you think of something, you can always go back and add it. So now that we know what a population is, why do we study populations? There are so many reasons why we want to study a population. It tells us so much about what's going on, okay? With scientists, they can see what's happening in a community, okay? So what a community is it's a particular area. So I've got an area of land, space, whatever, and it's all of the populations that would exist in that particular area, and they all interact together. Go back to your idea of when we were studying food chains and food webs, right? We had that area and you had all of the interrelationships of how energy transferred in that community. Well, here, these guys exist with each other all for different reasons, not just, because one eats the other, but there's a lot of things that go on from the producers all the way through all the members. And so we can look at how a community or, how that community is faring based on the populations that are there. And the more we know about it, the more that we can predict about what's going to happen to others. And that is extraordinarily helpful if we want to see if perhaps there are some populations that might be in danger of dying out, and that could be the effect that other populations have on them. So the more we know, the more we can predict. And our hypothesis testing, and here's something that goes right into scientific method and what we just finished talking about in the experimental design lab, is that you need populations because individuals can vary. And without large populations, aka our large sample size, you can run into problems. So, like when you had your plates, right, with your 12 seeds, well, that was, a small sample size. But when we gathered and went together with our class data, we increased that population number. And by increasing that population number, we got a better sense of what was really going on, because individual seeds can vary. You can just have, random duds or whatever. So it's an important thing to be able to look at the overall idea by having a large population. Population size. How does a population grow and shrink? I'm sure you can have some ideas right now about that yourself, but it really comes down to 4 things. 4 different factors are going to affect and determine how big a population is and how it grows. So we're going to look at the things that, a couple of things that increase and decrease the size of a population. So the first of these 4 factors is natality, and natality, otherwise known as the birth rate. And what the birth rate does is it increases the size of the population because obviously more babies are being born. And just like this is, and if you can notice it, it's much bigger now. I highly recommend checking out the status on this little baby panda bear right there. This was moments after it was born down at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., just about, I think, a month or 2 ago now. And for those of you who are on Twitter, you could follow the National Zoo, and they are putting up updates on how the little baby panda is doing. Mama's doing great. Baby panda's doing well. It's starting at now, the most recent picture that I've seen it's starting to get its, dark ears and the darkness around its eyes. So it's getting pretty cute. But man, when it's born, it is itty bitty. So that's the new baby panda. So natality increases population size. And that's obviously a big deal, especially when populations are endangered. And if population, obviously if all the individuals go away, then you have extinction of the species. So that's why they're monitoring so heavily and why it's such a big deal that this little baby panda was born. Mortality, conversely, is your death rate. And that is when individuals in a population die for whatever reason. So obviously that's going to decrease your population size. So here is a lovely little canine cemetery. So that's what happens to a population. Now, the third thing is immigration. You don't have to be born to increase population size. You could get individuals from other areas coming in to yours, and that's immigration. And that's when you're coming into an area. Whereas emigration would be decreasing the population size because individuals are moving out. Collectively, we talk about organisms migrating, and so that migration either means that they're leaving or they're coming. So it's going to be really important to understand that distinctive difference. Immigration, the organism is coming into the area. Emigration, the organism is leaving. So just for fun. So populations are not only affected by the other populations that exist around them, they are also directly affected by the environment that they're in. And there's a lot of things that go into how a population is effective, because obviously the environment, it surrounds and affects the organisms that live there. And there's a lot of things that we're going to talk about that act as factors as to how large or small that population can get. Some of those factors are known as biotic factors. Okay, bio, that means life, right? So these are your living, your organic factors. And so basically I say living, and I also like to say freshly dead, okay? Anything that, like, think of roadkill, things that have died, they are still considered biotic factors, even though they're not living anymore. They were alive. They're made of organic material. So these are biotic factors that are going to play a role in affecting. So let's think of some examples of this and what could be in an area or in a particular community. What could be some examples of a biotic factor to a population? What could be some living things that might affect the size or the growth or the the overall size of that population? So I want you to think about a couple for a minute and see if you can't jot a few of those down. Some abiotic factors, these are your non-living, okay? And again, we're going to come back to some ideas of this and get into some examples of what abiotic factors are. These are your so in the environment, there are non-living components that will influence how big a population gets, because both are critical. Both will affect the size of your population, and they affect it in numerous ways. In some ways, it can be of benefit to affect the population, and in some ways it can be detrimental. So it all depends on what's going on with the population at the time, and we are going to spend a lot of time talking about this, working with it, and getting you guys familiar with what this all means. And those factors can be limiting to the size of the population, which means that they're actually going to slow the growth down. Sometimes it means literally plummet it or actually decrease it and have it have negative growth, or it's going to keep it from rising very quickly. Okay, and limiting factors are both biotic and abiotic as well. And these are things that would be examples like what you see above here, so that we can kind of add some examples in here. So some abiotic limiting factors, those would be the amount of light that's available. So if you think in places like Alaska, right, during the winter, there's very little light, not to mention it's chilly, but light obviously is a huge importance to plants. So without light, you're not going to have what you need. Water. That's probably one of the most important abiotic factors that exist for living things. We're mostly water. We require water. Every living thing needs water to survive. So how much water is available to the population can certainly be a limiting factor in how quickly that population grows and can actually limit it. Heat, how much heat is necessary. Certain things like natural disasters, volcanic eruptions, floods, tornadoes, those kinds of things. Soil, how nutrient is the earth, and space. Space is a wicked important limiting factor because, if there's not enough space, things can't survive because you're going to run out of resources. So I think we as humans are starting to feel the crunch of space. We've been able to figure it out. We take care of the space thing by building up. Think of skyscrapers, right? They can house a lot of people in a very small space. Your biotic limiting factors, those are going to be things, again, that are going to limit, remember, limiting factors, they slow down the growth. So some biotic limiting factors, again, your living factors, are predators. Okay, so if I have something that's preying on me and eating members of my population, that's going to decrease because that's going to basically cause the mortality rate to go up. Food availability, everything we eat comes from living things, so that's important, and if food is scarce, that will slow down population. And disease. If a disease comes through a population, usually those are those are viruses, those are bacteria, those are all living things, and those can certainly play a huge role. Okay, so let's look at a few examples just to kind of finish things up for this podcast. So some examples of this. One of the things is what's called lake eutrophication. And lake eutrophication is when you get in a lake, there is huge algae blooms. So you can see that green in there, that's a huge amount of algae. And what happens when this occurs is that it blocks off the oxygen to the lake, and the things in it die. So if lake can't dissolve enough oxygen into it, basically because those algae are covering the whole thing, then things like other fish, other organisms eventually die out due to the lack of oxygen. And then you have things like the rabbit boom that happened in the early 20th century in Australia. You may have heard of the film, maybe even seen it, called The Rabbit-Proof Fence. And what they did in Australia, rabbits went nuts. They were introduced, and they had so much resource, so much space. They had no limiting factors. They literally boomed. And this is an actual photo taken from the early 30s of all of these bunnies, and they tried a bunch of things to really control this population, and there weren't enough predators, and they were getting into everything. So what they eventually did was they actually introduced a virus to the rabbits, and by introducing that virus, it basically killed so many of them, because even adding predators wasn't limiting them fast enough. So these are all things that can influence how big a population is. In the next Vodcast, we will spend some time looking at and interpreting graphs and how populations rise, and what that means for different parts, like when limiting factors aren't there, when they are, and how that influences the overall population and the ability of a population to sustain over time. So that's going to be it for tonight. So take care and have a good night, everybody, and we'll see you in class. Take it easy. Bye.